she, like most of my family, was practicing something called separation with love. That they had to do because I was terrorizing them. I was stealing from everybody when I was using. I was stealing from my mom, from my dad, making up stories, lying through my teeth, whatever I could do to maintain my addiction. And it all caught up. It all catches up with you. That's the thing, is that illicit drug use, drug addiction, it always catches up in the end.
I think the New York Times briefly described your story as a pillar of the community who became homeless as a result of opioid addiction and was saved by the police. I put something in an email, kind of hyping this event a little bit, that said from homelessness and 5 arrests to new life in Christ. So I think you have a pretty amazing story, and I'd like to spend at least the first part of what we do getting a little bit more flesh on that story. It seems like sometimes it's a pretty short arc in the stories that I've seen. So I'd like to maybe delve in a little bit more to your story and begin. As a child growing up, was drugs and alcohol, were they a part of your family? Were they a part of your community? What was your growing up like?
Well, I grew up in a pretty much middle class family here in the Bay Area, California. So my dad has struggled with alcoholism on and off throughout his life, but most of the time that I was growing up, he was not drinking at all. So drugs were not a huge part of me growing up. There was alcohol around our house. My parents had a liquor cabinet when guests came over, but it wasn't anything that it was prevalent. However, I believe that addiction is kind of a genetic thing. I remember my grandfather actually was also an alcoholic. He was an old World War II veteran. He lived in Las Vegas, and I remember going to visit him when I was a kid. And 10:30 in the morning, he when I was old enough, he had me in the kitchen mixing his bourbon and soda for him. So those are some of my earliest memories of alcohol and alcoholism, watching him kind of pass out on his lazy boy by 2 in the afternoon. And I just thought that was just, he was an old guy and that's how it was. I didn't know at the time that's alcoholism. That's what that does to you. And alcoholism, addiction, it's the same thing. It just manifests in different ways with different types of illicit substances, usually to kind of medicate away whatever pain that you're having. So, I'm a Gen Xer. I'm a child of the 80s. I grew up in the 80s, and, I did my share of experimenting in high school. We get some beer and go down to the beach, or, sit on the bleachers in high school and drink beer. And, that led to pot, and that led to cocaine. But it was never anything that I'd consider an addiction. It was, again, experimentation, having fun. And when I came out of high school, I actually kind of went the other direction and started using less drugs, less alcohol. And by the time I was 22, I stopped pretty much everything except drinking. I was still a drinker. I wouldn't consider myself, I wasn't like a daily drinker. I was a weekend warrior guy. And I went through the motions like everybody else. I went to college. I, met my now wife, got a job, I was working. And, for me, things didn't kind of materialize until later on. And one of the things that I've used to describe that is, the pressures of life. So my wife and I started a family. I have two beautiful kids. I have a 15-year-old daughter and a 12-year-old son. They mean the world to me. But when you have kids and you have a mortgage payment like we had because we purchased a home, and you have a high stress job like I had, those are all pressure type of situations that you kind of fall under. And so that pressure kind of continued to build over the years, and I let resentment kind of creep into my life. I was working for the government. I had a county job as a child support officer. So that's a difficult job because you're dealing, you're the bad guy a lot of the time, dealing with non-custodial parents that owe child support, and enforcing that. And while you're doing good, it's also very painful in that you're watching how hard it is for people to understand the need to support their children, while at the same time having issues seeing their children, things of that nature, because of, again, resentment, which I believe is kind of the root of a lot of people's addiction and what leads them to addiction. I think it's the root of evil, to be quite frank. And so, you hit that glass ceiling at your job, and you kind of just get complacent, And I got unhappy. I started resenting the fact that, I wasn't getting promoted. I wasn't moving up any higher. My wife and I were having, some financial difficulty. I wouldn't call it a huge amount of financial difficulty until maybe 2008, when kind of the real estate market popped and our home was upside down in value. Things got really tough at that point. You start looking around for people to blame. And that's, one of the things that definitely happened to me, and it was causing marital problems between my wife and I. And I'll back up and say that, I grew up as a non-practicing Catholic. When I was young, I was one of those twice a year churchgoers. It was, Christmas and Easter. That's how I rolled. And that's how my family still rolls today, except for me. I've had a spiritual awakening, let's put it that way. So God wasn't a big part of our equation growing up. It wasn't a big part of the conversation in my family. The Bible wasn't a big part of our conversation in the family. Faith wasn't a big part of our conversation in our family. It was all about self-will, being able to succeed on your own, stepping up and doing it on your own. And, it wasn't later until I was in recovery that I realized that you really aren't alone. God really, at the moment that you're most alone, sometimes that's when you can hear the clearest. And that's kind of what happened to me. And I'll be happy to kind of talk about that with you as we go on in this conversation. But, so I had these issues. I had this kind of resentment bubbling up. I had the financial issues going on with my wife. Our marriage was not doing so great, but I had 2 small children, and I was having some weight problems. I was heavy. I was about 310 pounds at the time when my daughter was born, which was 2006. So all of these things kind of contributed to me kind of making it, let's say, opening the door, making it easier for me to self-medicate when the opportunity presented itself. And that opportunity presented itself in early 2015 when I was 44 years old. And I had surgery on my foot where they had to insert 2 titanium screws in my foot. And they sent me home from the hospital with a 30-day supply of 10 milligram oxycodone. And that's where my addiction manifested. It wasn't with alcohol. It wasn't with gambling, although those things I did probably too much. I was always that guy that would go to Vegas and lose all his money and have to come home and grovel to his wife for losing too much, more than he was supposed to. Or the guy at the party that would drink a little too much and end up praying to the porcelain goddess, they would say, as the expression goes.
Driving the porcelain bus. Yeah.
Driving the porcelain bus, and always making it home, though, always somehow ending up back in the driveway at home. But, the addiction really manifested with the opioids, with oxycodone, because it brought me this whole new feeling that I've never had before, this euphoric feeling. I always tell people that, I was supposed to take 10 milligrams at a time of that pill. But when I started abusing it, when I got to 30 milligrams, that was kind of the moment that it went from just feeling a little loopy to actually feeling high, being euphoric, and where all my problems melted away. And that's how my addiction began.
Wow. Yeah, you can see kind of this whole kind of underpinning, right? Of there's some family history, there's some things going on in your life, there's some kind of historical factors with the housing crisis, that happened, the bubble bursting, and then the availability of opioids increased incredibly, and then it just sounds like you were in a vulnerable spot where something like that was really attractive to you.
Yeah, it was an opportunity for me to escape. Let's put it that way. So, not only did I have, my foot in a boot, but it allowed me to escape from all my other issues, which were the issues that are in here in your heart, in your soul, the issues of, the resentment, the mistrust, the dishonesty that comes along with that. And then, of course, the financial pressures, and then the physical pressures of being severely overweight and then having two small kids climbing on you and your back's always hurting. I mean, there's just little things like that people all take for granted all the time because they're things that they experience. But for me, it was like a confluence of all of those events all together that opened the door to my addiction.
What, you mentioned kind of at 30 milligrams, you first experienced the euphoria. What was the first sign that, hey, this is different, or this is becoming a problem? What was kind of the first sign to you that things were going in a bad direction? Hi, this is Jason Yunker from Resilient Recovery Ministries. I hope that you're enjoying our conversation with Tom Wolfe. We are an organization that does two main things. We hold support groups / Bible studies for people in recovery, and we teach pastors and lay leaders how to speak to somebody in a way that motivates them to seek treatment. If you like this video, please click like, and please consider a donation to Resilient Recovery Ministry. What was the first sign that, hey, this is different, or this is becoming a problem? What was kind of the first sign to you that things were going in a bad direction?
When I started running low on that month's supply of pills, because I was, not using them as prescribed, as directed. I was running out after about 10 days. So the first thing that I noticed is that I started going into what I now know as withdrawal, or you hear that term now, dope sick. I was, there's a show on Hulu about that right now. I got dope sick. That was the first inclination that there might be a problem. But, instead of addressing that problem, you're inclined in addiction to feed that problem, because that instant gratification of taking more makes that pain go away. So, that's when I started exploring other options, like where I could purchase pills on the street, and then started to actually, go to the street to buy those pills. And I found out very quickly how expensive that was. I spent a lot of money purchasing pills off the street, but it was also amazing to me how easy it was to find those pills here in San Francisco, which is, to me, the epicenter of the drug crisis in America right now. I went down to there's an intersection in the Tenderloin neighborhood of San Francisco called Golden Gate and Leavenworth, and I found 6 guys the first time I went down there that were selling a variety of different pain pills. So it was like just an open market. I could pick and choose what I wanted to buy, and as long as I had the money, they would do business with me. And I was off to the races, literally, at that point.
Yeah, very easy. Can you describe, maybe you can't, I don't know, what that thought process is like when you recognize, oh, I'm feeling some dope sickness, and rather than addressing the problem, I'm gonna take, as you said, kind of the immediate gratification route. I'm gonna go look for another option to continue using. What was it, a conscious thought process? Were you kind of on autopilot? What's that like?
The best way I can describe it is it was an obsession. So I was thinking about the drugs all the time. So as I started running low, I started feeling not so good, because physical withdrawals is like a combination of your skin is crawling, plus stomach issues, plus you feel feverish, and then you just obsess. You sit there and you think about the drug all the time. I don't know how else to describe it, but it really grips you in that way, to the point where, I was wearing a boot, so it was hard for me to drive. It was my right foot, but I was still going into the car when I shouldn't have been. And I'm driving down to a really bad neighborhood in San Francisco, which I had only driven through in the past. And I'm out there on the street actively looking for people to sell me drugs that I need to feed this addiction to stop this withdrawal. So that's already pretty irrational, and that's just at the beginning. But that's the power of addiction. That's how it can hijack your survival instincts in your mind, and it makes it really easy for you to rationalize that you need more.
Yeah, I've read this book called The Biology of Desire, and it talked about dopamine's function as a motivator, not as a reward, but as a motivator and something that gives you drive to do things. And what you described with that obsession fits very neatly into this scientist's conceptualization of what's going on with dopamine, that it causes you to have a drive. So you've got all those, things that were going on in your life that made you kind of susceptible. Now you've got physical illness as well when you're not using it. And then your brain's kind of drive and motivation has you obsessing on it and thinking about it all the time.
I would agree with that. So, there's a chart that I have, and I can send it to you offline, and it shows the release of dopamine in your brain for certain things that you ingest into your body. So chocolate, it's like a baseline of 1. Caffeine, it's like a baseline of 1.5. Cocaine is a baseline of 3. Heroin is a baseline of 4. And then crystal methamphetamine is a baseline of 10.
Wow.
So it releases, 10 times more dopamine into your brain than chocolate does. And, dopamine is also that pleasure chemical that gets released into your brain. And when you use it for long enough, you pretty much want it all the time. And you're willing at that point, you're motivated at that point to do whatever it takes to continue to feed that. And that's kind of the nature of addiction. So when we talk about it being a disease of the mind, that's one of the things that we should focus on. But at the same time, addiction is solely the only disease that I know of that in existence that's also a disease of the spirit. I really believe that.
Yeah.
Because it leaves you in this kind of spiritually bankrupt state. That's kind of the end result. It betrays you along the way, in that you're initially using these drugs to make you feel good, to take away the pain. But pretty soon it becomes only about not feeling good anymore, but only about keeping the pain away. So you're almost using not only out of a psychological and physical need, but also the spiritual need to continue to numb that kind of bankruptness or that kind of corruption that you have kind of in here in your soul. I believe that. And that's why, that's what's the beautiful thing about recovery, is that it frees you literally. You hear that term, the bondage, it frees you from that bondage. It really does. It really does. And I'm living proof of that. And I'm happy to talk about it and tell anybody that, faith had a lot to do with that, because it restores your soul. And that's the big thing. It was like real salvation.
Yeah. I think, it's absolutely true there. And I don't want to minimize it in any way. There's these physical, observable processes that we can see in the brain and in the body. And that's a huge portion of what's happening. Right. But what you're saying is that there's a spiritual aspect as well. And I think when we only look at one aspect of what's driving the addiction, it's always going to be a bit compromised and a bit limited.
I 100% agree. And, if we have time, I have a couple of stories I could share with you about, how, I was touched by, I'm a Christian. So, I was touched by Jesus 3 different times in my life, in my addiction and then in recovery. And, I'd be happy to share with you what those moments were and what they felt like for me and how they changed my life.
Yeah, for sure. I have a couple questions before we get to that. And then I absolutely want to hear about those 3 times. So one is, I'm curious, you talked about some of the internal things that were happening for you. And then also just the easy availability of purchasing drugs on the street. Was there anything else that either, was kind of made addiction easier or made it harder that you noticed in your own story?
Well, so it's easy in that it's everywhere in San Francisco. There's, just in one neighborhood alone last year, the Tenderloin, where I was purchasing my drugs and then eventually was homeless. The San Francisco Police Department just in that neighborhood arrested 786 drug dealers last year, to give you some perspective. And they pulled more than 40 kilos of just fentanyl. We're not talking about meth and cocaine, just fentanyl. They pulled 40 kilos off the street, and that's just a fraction of what's actually out there. So when you talk about drug availability, and when you have that the market saturated with that much product, the price goes down. So now you can purchase fentanyl on the street for as little as $7. You can purchase crack cocaine on the street for as little as $5. So switching from pills to illicit drugs was an easy choice for me because of economic reasons.
Yeah.
So it did the job equally that the pills were doing. And pills, that's different. Pills are $30 a pop on the street. That's how much they cost. So I was saving a lot of money because I was going bankrupt, because I had spent well over $100,000 just on pills when I was purchasing them off the street. So I made a couple of drug dealers very, very rich with the money that I was spending. But, on the flip side of that, you can purchase 1/8 of a gram of heroin for $10 on the street, just to give you some perspective on how cheap those drugs were. So that's part of it. The hard part of addiction was trying to hide it from my family. That's the big thing. So in addiction, in recovery, we learn, and my wife has gone to a lot of meetings too, to help her, Al-Anon meetings, things like that, to help her. We consider ourselves a family in recovery, first of all. It's not just myself, it's my wife and my kids. We're all in recovery, and we all try to live by a certain set of values now that are all in line within that recovery framework. So for me, it was about, hiding this addiction from my wife. That was very hard. Hiding it from my kids, it was very hard. And not the actual hiding part that was hard, it was the lying part that was hard. So
it was hard on you to lie.
Yeah. Oh yes. It was terrible. And I felt bad for my wife, because I know there was a certain degree of denial with her that was going on, because it's like, she doesn't want to believe it, that this man that I've been married to for 15 years, that's the father to my kids, that's been the breadwinner in this family, that's, helped us build this life together of a home and all of this, has fallen so far down that he's stealing money out of my purse to go down to the Tenderloin and buy drugs, or that I'm driving under the influence with my wife and kids in the car, or with my kids in the car. It's a hard thing for someone to accept, right? And then for me, it's all about the guilt that comes with that, looking my wife in the eye and telling her a bull-faced lie, this person that I've been with since 1992, that's hard. Or looking at your babies and telling them a bull-faced lie, or making up some story to try to justify your need to leave the home at 10 o'clock at night and drive down to the bad part of town to buy some drugs because you needed your fix. Those are the kinds of things that are really, really hard. And I had, it was only because of recovery and finding faith that I was able to reconcile those things within myself, which gave me an opportunity to heal as a human being.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm thinking of Jesus' encouragement: "Come unto me, all you who are burdened." That there's a burden to you, to yourself, and to your soul in this lying that's happening, in this going against your own values that's happening, in the disintegration of your relationships and your jobs. And I know at one point you were actually working for drug dealers to help support what you were doing. So you had gone from enforcing law, right, and on one end, and enforcing laws around helping families be functional and helping kids, get the resources that they needed. Can you talk a little bit about, what kind of things you were doing to fund the addiction?
So when I was still in the home, I was, I stopped paying the mortgage, first of all. And I was using that money that was supposed to go to the mortgage to buy drugs. Because at the time, at the peak of my addiction, when I was still using pills before I switched to heroin and fentanyl, I was taking, at the peak, about 560 milligrams a day of oxycodone. So if
Can you put that in perspective?
Yeah,
what does that mean?
I was taking 7 80-milligram oxycodone tablets a day. So a normal person, like when you have surgery, you're taking 5 to 10 milligrams of oxycodone that's usually mixed with some kind of Tylenol. That's a Percocet, which is 5 milligrams oxycodone and then 500 milligrams of Tylenol. So I was taking 560 milligrams of just pure oxycodone.
Wow.
Right, a day. So if you took that now, you would die. You would die of an overdose immediately. But addiction, just like the drug use, is a progressive disease. So my tolerance got higher and higher and higher and higher. And if you do the math, I was paying $30 a pill, and I was using 7 pills a day times 7 days a week. That's $210 a day times 7. And I did that for a couple of years, almost 3 years. So, that if you do the math, it's $100,000 that I spent on those pills. And so that was one of the things I was doing. The bills weren't getting paid. And then I was hiding that debt from my wife. And that was the hard thing. That's where that heavy guilt came in for me, was that, I knew that I was putting everything at risk, but 1, I couldn't stop. And 2, addiction is the kind of disease that makes you not care.
Mhm.
It just makes you stop caring about things. I don't know how else to put it,
Feels a
because,
little bit dead inside, maybe.
oh, absolutely. It's not a little bit. I was all the way dead inside, in that, it twists the logic in your mind. And that so that the end result of everything that you do must, not has to, but must end up with you obtaining more drugs to maintain and support your addiction. Later on, when I was on the street, I did what most people on the street have to do to survive. So first of all, I signed up for general relief or general assistance, which is a form of welfare that the county gives out, along with some food stamps. I would get that money and, of course, use that to support my drug habit as best I could, and then sell my food stamps for like 50 cents on the dollar to various different local merchants that would purchase them kind of under the table and use that money for drugs. And when that money would run out, then I would go to Walgreens or Target and shoplift like everybody else was doing. And that, I'm not excusing my behavior. I'm just explaining this is the thing. These are the things that I was motivated to do, that I had rationalized in my head that were okay to do because of my need to feed my addiction.
Mhm.
Right. Then later on, I became a mule for the drug dealers. I started holding drugs for street level drug dealers in the neighborhood. So what they do is they seek out people that are homeless on the street that are using, and they offer to pay them in heroin or other drugs to hold their stash for them, so that if the police come and bust that drug dealer, they're not holding a large amount of drugs, so the charges will be less. So I started doing that. And that's really how I ended up maintaining my addiction for the time that I was on the street, because I was being paid in heroin and cocaine and later on fentanyl, for holding these drugs. But that's also what got me involved in the criminal justice system, and that's how I got arrested.
Mhm.
Uh, when I was out there on the street on April 29th, 2018, I remember it was a Sunday,
Mhm.
and I was holding for about 6 different dealers at the same time on the block. The police did a
Oh, you
sting.
were an entrepreneur.
Oh yeah, I had my hustle, right? That's what we call it. I had my hustle going. And the police, when it was a one-way street and the police car came rolling up going the wrong way. And when that happens, you know that something bad is going down.
Uh-huh.
And it turns out they were looking for me, not for the drug dealers, because they had seen through surveillance that I was the one holding all the drugs.
If you're enjoying what you're seeing, please click the link below and make a donation to Resilient Recovery. These donations help us fulfill our mission.
And I got caught with 4.5 ounces of heroin on my person.
Hmm.
And at the time, I'd never been arrested before in my life. I'd never been involved in the criminal justice system ever, other than a speeding ticket. I thought I was going to go to prison, but I went to jail. They booked me in jail, and they released me the next day,
Hmm.
on my own recognizance, back into homelessness. So I was
Hmm.
released back onto the street, and I went right back to the neighborhood. Showed the dealers, that had lost their drugs, that I'd been arrested. I had my little wristband from jail and everything, and they understand that that's part of the deal, that happens. And I continued to do the same thing, and I got caught in what I call this washing machine, because at that
Hmm.
point I was a mark for the police. At that point, they knew
Hmm.
who I was, and I was supposed to stay away from that neighborhood. The court had imposed a stay away order on me to stay 150 yards away from that block that I was living on, but I didn't. So over the next 3 months, I got arrested a total of 6 times, either for holding drugs for the dealers or violating that stay away order. And each time that I got arrested, the first 5 times I got arrested, I'd spend a couple of days in jail, and then they would release me back on my own recognizance, back into homelessness each time.
Hmm.
It wasn't until the sixth time, when I was wearing an ankle monitor already, that I violated my stay away order, and they said, you caught too many cases too close together. That's the term they used, and we can't let you out anymore. So I ended up spending about 3 months in county jail.
Wow. Yeah, you talked about having 3 experiences with Jesus. You also had 6 experiences with the criminal justice system.
Right.
And my guess is that Jesus was also working through the criminal justice system to get you to a place where you were physically separated from the drugs. But what was that kind of the beginning of a pathway out of where you were? What talk a little bit about those 3 stories and about how you get out of this.
So definitely that was the pathway, and the phrase I like to use is that compassion comes in many forms. So of course, at the time when I'm being arrested and cuffed, I didn't think that that was compassionate. I was like, "Why are you bothering me? Leave me alone!" Right? But later in recovery, and you start looking back and reflecting on everything that happened to you. you start to understand that I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for one cop. There was one cop out there that just kind of took a notice of me and kept arresting me. He arrested me 4 out of the 6 times that I got arrested. And I'll never forget the last time he arrested me. I'm at the station getting ready to go to the big county jail, and he looks at me and he says, "You know, you're dirty, you're skinny. I don't know what's going on in your life, but get yourself cleaned up and get back to your family." And I found out later that while I was out on the street, my wife had called the police station, and that was the officer that he had spoken to, that she had spoken to, and she told him the story. So he knew who I was because she had made that call just because she was worried about me. She knew I was out on the street. She didn't know if I was alive or dead. There was no communication, no contact. So it turns out that yes, God was already working in my life through her, even at that point. And then, like I said, that's one of the events that kind of started getting me thinking. I remember tearing up when he told me that, because that guilt came flowing. It kept coming. It came right back into my life again, and the feeling of missing my family, missing my kids, and thinking of the pain that I had caused them. That started to get me thinking right there that maybe I need something different. I need to do something different than what I'm doing now.
Yeah. So some connections with, your wife out of love, checking up on you, a police officer out of love and compassion, arresting you, and then the Holy Spirit placing guilt on you out of compassion. That's a much maligned sentiment in our culture today, but guilt is there for a reason. And it sounds like that was part of what happened as well. So how else do you get out of where you were to where you are now? How does that even happen?
So, I did it with a combination of things. This is the thing about recovery from addiction, is that there's no silver bullet. Everybody's story is different, and it's going to require a variety of different things working together. And that may be hard for some people right now in the drug world out there, and in the world of recovery and in the world of drug policy. There's all these arguments about whether harm reduction is better or is abstinence treatment better. And there's people attacking abstinence-based treatment as not being real treatment. And there's people attacking harm reduction as saying that you're just enabling people. And instead of attacking and fighting each other, we all need to stop and put down our ideologies and just try to work together. And I try to tell people that I'm actually an example of everything. So I was held accountable by the police, right? I was given what they call medically assisted treatment in jail. They gave me something called Suboxone or buprenorphine for 5 days to help me kick the physical withdrawals of the heroin and fentanyl. And then from there, after sitting in jail for another couple of months, I went to a 6-month inpatient abstinence-based, faith-based 12-step program that laid the foundations for my recovery. So it was really a combination of accountability, harm reduction, and abstinence-based treatment that got me to where I am today. And I try to explain that to people on both sides. And, some people are very receptive to it. Some people shun it because of the faith-based accent, the faith-based relationship, and they, whatever. Some people that are harm reductionists say that, abstinence doesn't work, but I'm sitting here 3.5 years clean and sober, and I'm sitting here telling you that of course it works. Yeah. And millions of other people in recovery today are abstinent from drugs and alcohol. Of course it works, right? For them to suggest it doesn't is frankly irresponsible.
Some good friends that are on 10 years of abstinence from opiates, and dozens of years from meth. Yeah, it absolutely works.
And I know people that have been using Suboxone for 3 or 4 years that are out there working as sponsors in AA, helping people find recovery. So I'm not saying that one way is better than the other. What I'm saying is all of them can work together, kind of through this lens of love and compassion, right? And I think accountability is part of love and compassion. I think the book of Romans kind of lays that out pretty clearly in the Bible. Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, it's funny. So this is one of the stories of where, God kind of Jesus touched my life. So when I was in jail, they have in each pod, the pod that I was in, they have like a little library with a few books, mostly their Bibles and Alcoholics Anonymous books, right?
Uh-huh.
And as I was going in there, there's a trash can right next to the room. And I just kind of glanced in the trash can, and there was this Bible. This Bible right here. I'm going to see if I can show it to you. This guy.
That very one.
This very Bible. And I'm sorry it's not come. There we go. That very Bible was sitting in the trash.
That is the religious relic right there.
Right there.
The actual one.
And I thought that was disrespectful. Let's put it that way, that it was in the trash. So I pulled it out of the trash, and someone had earmarked one of the pages, and I opened it up and I read what it said. And it was Romans chapter 5. That was the first thing I'd read in the Bible since I was a little kid. And if I can just read is it okay to read a quick passage from that?
Absolutely.
All right. So Romans 5, right? 5:1. Therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Through him, we have also obtained access by faith into this grace in which we stand, and we rejoice in hope of the glory of God. Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. That was the very first thing I read in that Bible. And I was hooked. I was hooked. I mean, I don't know how else to say it, but it was like, it couldn't have been more prophetic that was there at that very moment in time while I'm sitting in jail after having lost everything that matters to me in my life. And I get emotional when I talk about that, because I really wouldn't be here if it wasn't for finding faith in God and in Jesus. It wouldn't be here. And I think it's fair to talk about that, and as part of the recovery model, and not enough people do, and everybody talks about data-driven, evidence-based solutions, but empirical evidence is still evidence. We talk about faith all the time, and and that's Hebrews 11:1 talks about faith. You can't see it, you have to believe in it, but it's there. It's there.
Baylor University and Duke are doing some good research on faith-based initiatives, and there's definitely an empirical basis for it. I teared up a little bit when you read that passage, because the tail end of that was a milestone in my own recovery, with that not only so, but we glory in our suffering. And I realized that throughout my life, what I was trying to do always was avoid suffering, even in the most minute tasks. I didn't want to clean out my car because it was a hassle, and I wanted to go do something fun on my phone. Whatever it was just my desire to avoid suffering at all costs got me in some pretty dark situations. And learning that suffering was actually a tool that could build me up and strengthen me, and I could actually rejoice in suffering, was a profound revelation, and a huge milestone in my own recovery. Right. So, yeah. I mean, so that's one example of Christ being there for you. You said you had two more.
Well, so when I was maybe the first week I was in rehab, and this is kind of a silly story. So I didn't have any money. I walked into rehab with a nickel in my pocket. I remember, because I'd gotten bailed out of jail by my brother on condition I go to rehab. So I walk into rehab with a nickel in my pocket and a pack of cigarettes that he bought me. Right. I don't know if in rehab, a lot of people smoke.
Really?
It's what it is.
Some coffee drinking going on too, maybe
a little coffee drinking too. So I go in and I write a letter to my mom to let her know where I am at. I'm okay. And I'm in rehab, and so my mom is in her early 80s at the time, right? I'm here, 48-year-old man, writing a letter to my mom, letting her know I'm alive. Yeah, I'm in rehab. And
you were off the radar for a while for her.
Oh, definitely off the radar. And she, like most of my family, was practicing something called separation with love. They had to do, because I was terrorizing them. I was stealing from everybody when I was using. I was stealing from my mom, from my dad, making up stories, lying through my teeth, whatever I could do to maintain my addiction. And, it all caught up. It all catches up with you. That's the thing, is that illicit drug use, drug addiction, it always catches up in the end. It always wins in the end. There's no way you can go through your whole life and have a successful, truly happy, free life when you're living in the bondage of addiction. It just doesn't work,
You
man.
reap what you sow
That's right.
eventually.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I write her this letter and I ask her for, can you send me a little bit of money so I can buy cigarettes, right?
So your first letter to your mom, you ask her for money,
yeah,
huh?
asking her for money, right? So a few days later, I get a letter back from her, and she there's $60 in there so I can buy cigarettes, because
That's a lot of cigarettes.
That's the most money you could have in rehab at any given time. Was you couldn't have any more than $60. That was the rule. I had $60 to buy smokes, but she also had put a little postcard in there that said, even when you turn your back on God, God still has your back. And then she said for me to read the book of Luke, talking about the prodigal son returning, etc. And I read it and I cried and cried and cried and cried and cried and cried. And that was another moment where I felt kind of like, God's love. I felt my mom's love. I was like, man, I'm really not alone, am I? And I still was having trouble with that because I was still early in my recovery. I think the first month I was in rehab, I spent most of that time feeling really guilty and feeling really sorry for myself. Instead of I hadn't learned yet how to look at life through a lens of gratitude. Let's put it that way.
Or is
Right.
it sort of like you're feeling guilty, but it's not a guilt that leads to repentance and new life. It's just like a self-directed
Definitely like
animosity and dislike of yourself. Is that
definitely like, how the heck did I get here? What have I done? It was like that. Like, what have I done? Yeah, blame. So there was a lot of that the first month. A lot of, I went to the Salvation Army, ARC, so they're faith-based, obviously, and I spent a lot of time kneeling at the chapel, crying, tears in my eyes, asking and begging for forgiveness. And then they started talking to me about, it's okay to definitely ask and for salvation and forgiveness, but you want to start thanking God for putting you here, instead of you being out on the street still, because that's where you would be otherwise, or being dead, or being in jail or prison. So they slowly, through that and through the 12-step program, I learned to kind of start turning around and looking at things through a lens of gratitude, starting to take accountability for the things that I had done, and started to forgive myself. And that was really kind of the first step, is, you admit you have a problem, you turn your will and your life over to the care of God as you understand them. And then you start asking for forgiveness for the things that you have done, so that you can turn around and start asking for forgiveness from others and start making amends. That's the way I look at it. And that kind of leads me to the third time that I felt like really God kind of touched my life. The second month that I was there, they had what they call family day at the rehab. And I had invited my wife to come, and she had already put a restraining order on me. So I wasn't even supposed to do that, but I reached out through my dad, who then called her and said, hey, so she showed up.
Yeah. It's illegal for you, illegal for her.
That's
even,
right.
Right. To
That's
violate
right.
that order. Yeah.
Right. But it's not illegal for my dad to tell her. So,
right.
So we had to get creative. Right. So
you learned something on the streets, right?
Right. That's right. So she shows up that day.
Wow.
And she made it up to the top of the steps of the rehab, and she couldn't go any further because it was just too hard for her. And someone asked her, hey, can I help you? And she said, yeah, I'm here to see Tom Wolfe, but I can't go in. I just can't do it. So they went and found me, and I went outside and I saw her for the first time in over a year.
Wow.
And that was emotional. That was hard. She was still very scared, confused, upset, because, while I was going through all of this stuff with my addiction and homelessness, my wife and my kids were hanging by a thread the whole time. Like, trying to figure out how not to lose the home to foreclosure because I'd stopped paying the mortgage. Trying to figure out how to feed her kids.
Yeah, they're in poverty, probably, right?
Definitely.
Salary and
definitely. So, that's rough, man. And I got to own that in my recovery, and I do own it in my recovery, and I'm not ashamed of that. It is what it is, and that's the power of salvation and the power of grace working in my life, right? So anyway, I'm standing there talking to her, and the conversation's not going very well. It's tears and not like yelling, not going well, but just not going well. And that she's like, I don't know if I can do this. Too much has happened, all these things. And the pastor at the Salvation Army, Major Darren Trimmer, I'll never forget. He walks up to us and he introduces himself to my wife. And I said, "Oh, this is our pastor. This is Major Darren." And he looks at my wife and he says, "I want you to know that your husband is a good man. He's a good man, and he's learning to love God, and he's trying really hard to do the right thing. And I just want you to know that we like him. We're glad he's here, and we're going to do everything we can to help him." And I don't know if it was the way he said it or how he said it, but it opened the floodgates at that moment to reconciliation, which happened much, much later with my wife and kids. But that opened the door, because I think my wife at that point thought maybe she could trust him. And, it just, I don't know how else to say it, man. I'm sorry if I'm getting emotional talking about it, but it's real. That really went down just like that. And I started to, have conversations with her on the phone, even though I wasn't supposed to. Little conversations, 5-10 minutes, just to check in on the kids and things like that. And none of that had happened before that. But he opened the door to that healing to begin. Mm-hmm. And that's another way that God was definitely working in my life.
If you're okay, I'd like to just explain a little of our Lutheran doctrine that I think kind of puts what you're talking about in perspective. So we talk about there being law and gospel in the Bible, and that God uses both, right? And the law applies to everybody. Like, we all know what's wrong and what's right, and so that guilt happens, and it does its function. It shows us what's wrong and what's right. It leads us to repentance. It can maybe curb the worst aspects of our sinful nature, but the gospel is what you're talking about with that grace and that gratitude and God's promises, and the fact that you are new in Christ, and that this pastor can see you now with that righteousness that Christ gave you. And that is what truly, in our belief, that's what truly motivates change. Is there's this gospel motivation that then that's the true fuel of change. It changes your heart, changes what you want to be doing, and gives you new life in Christ. And I hear pieces of that in all through your story, that law and gospel were both important in what became your recovery.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, and it's true. And, faith is still a huge part of our lives. I now have 3 Bibles in my house. Not to say that 3 Bibles in my house, but it's one for me and one for each of my kids, and we read them. We read it together, which is important, that they understand a little bit about how I found my salvation, mm-hmm. And how that Bible can help guide them, mm-hmm. To making better choices. Let's put it that way.
Yep, that's one of its functions. Is it shows us what's right and wrong. The other thing is that once we've been converted, once we've had that gospel experience, then the law becomes a guide that shows us how to live in a way to please this person that we love so much for what they've done for us, that it becomes something we get to do, not something we have to do. Right living is something we get to do. It's a privilege and an honor and a grace in and of itself.
Well, and it's a relief.
Yeah.
I mean, the beauty of recovery is that I can be honest with myself and honest with my family. I don't know how many nights I lay awake in my addiction, losing sleep, trying to remember all the lies that I had told, so that I could lie on top of those lies to keep the lie going. I mean, what a burden. True insanity, and an incredible burden.
Yeah, bondage.
And I don't have to live that way anymore. And that's the freedom that we talk about. Aside from the freedom from the physical aspects of the drugs, and the mental aspects of it, but the fact that you can just be you now, mm-hmm. And I didn't discover that until I was 48 years old, but it's never too late. It's really never too late. And it's the most liberating thing. And so when I tell people now that my life is better now in recovery than it was even before I got sick with addiction, it's absolutely true.
Yeah.
It's absolutely true. And a huge part of that for me and my family is our faith.
Yeah. When a seed goes into the ground and it dies, and then new life comes, and it's much bigger than it was before. And I think that kind of parallels your story, that you went really down, and a kind of symbolic death really in this murky underworld, and you were buried in Christ, and now out of this comes a life that was better than the life you had before that.
Yeah.
That death. Yeah,
it is. And so now, one the 12th step in Alcoholics Anonymous, they talk about carrying this message to other alcoholics to try to help people. So I try to do that kind of on a loudspeaker in my advocacy work out there. So I'm all about recovery education, you could say, drug education, but recovery education, to talk about the benefits of recovery to the vast majority of America that really has a 30,000-foot view about addiction and recovery and all the pain and suffering that comes with addiction and the intersectionality of addiction with homelessness. And they have this really large view, and the government's only listening to a certain subgroup of people. And so I just try to challenge everybody to think differently about this in my advocacy work that I do now and my activism that I do now, to try to get the word out there that recovery is really the way out for so many things. It's really the way out for homelessness. It is, regardless of what you may think. It's not just a housing issue. It's an untreated addiction and mental illness, and recovery from those things is your way out. And I'd like to remind people all the time that the 6-month inpatient treatment program I went to also ended my homelessness. And that's one of the things that people. It's like a light bulb goes off in their head when I tell them that. They're like, "Oh yeah, I did." And it's like, yeah, how did we forget that? That drug treatment actually ends your homelessness. And that's something that we should definitely bring back to the table and talk more about.
Hi, this is Jason Yunker. I hope you are enjoying this discussion and learning something. In the next section of this discussion, we're going to be looking at specific policies and actions that churches can take that will either help people get out of homelessness and addiction, or that may actually be detrimental to the folks who are homeless and addicted. Yeah, I'd like to switch gears a little bit. And one thing I like about, or that really resonates with me, is that this idea that there's not one cause of addiction, there's not one silver bullet that gets you out of it. Faith can be a huge part of it for people. So, you mentioned that going to a 6-month program ended your homelessness. What do you think are maybe some myths that people have about drug addiction and homelessness that aren't helpful?
Well, the number one myth is that you can manage your addiction. That's the biggest myth of all, right? And that's the myth that's unfortunately being pushed at the national level by harm reduction folks, is that you can manage your addiction. That's just not true. There's no such thing as sitting down by the fire after a long day at work and snorting some heroin and have everything be okay. That's a misnomer. And I'm sorry that, there's a very, very relevant individual that wrote a whole book talking about
Harvard professor, perhaps
drug use for grown-ups, and sitting in, and that's from his book, sitting by the fire after a long day at work and snorting a couple of lines of heroin. And I'm just sitting here going, man. So that's either arrogant presumption, or that's a drug addict actually talking, or it's going to catch up with them, and it's probably all three of those things. It will eventually catch up to you in the end. It's not the same as pouring a scotch on the rocks after work. It's not the same thing. And I think that they try to minimize the fact that these illicit drugs aren't as dangerous as people suggest that they are, people say they are. And I'm sitting here pointing at the fact that we had 100,000 overdose deaths from April 2020 to April 2021 in the United States. First time ever that it's gotten to that point, to 100,000. And sitting here saying, no, they're not. What do you mean they're not dangerous? Of course they're dangerous. Look, Look what's happening. Not to mention the other 20 million people in active addiction or alcoholism in the United States right now. Of course, it's a problem. And so I think that's the most dangerous myth that's being floated around out there right now, and it's much deeper and more prevalent in people's thinking than we, I think, realize.
Yeah, I hear a lot of it, it's true. Alcohol, if you look at the costs of alcohol and so on, it's really huge, right? And the what it does to people's health and so on. But sometimes you hear the argument that, well, because alcohol is really terrible, but it's a legal drug. Actually, these legal drugs would be much less harmful if we just legalize them. What's your thought about that?
So you hear the term safe supply being thrown around more and more and more now. And that's what that is. That's safe supply. They're saying, well, if we have a legal regulated supply of heroin and fentanyl, it would reduce the overdose deaths. And my answer to that is I kind of laugh, because that shows me that people don't really have a deeper understanding of what's really happening right now in the world of drugs, how all the drugs now have become synthetic. Illicit fentanyl is made in a lab. It's not grown in a field like heroin is through opium poppies, right? Crystal meth, they've changed the chemical composition of the crystal methamphetamine that's being smuggled across our borders into the United States now. So they're not using ephedrine anymore. They're using the different combination of drugs that's making people appear to have schizophrenia when they use it. And they're producing them in mass quantity, like tons and tons and tons of these drugs. And literally tons of these drugs are being smuggled across our borders monthly in the United States. And no other country has that type of issue, where we share a border with a country that's literally producing tons and tons of these drugs. And much like with the legalization of marijuana, people say, well, if we legalize it and regulate it, the black market in marijuana, black market will go away. Well, has it gone away? No. Is it thriving like it always has been? Yes. What happened? People on the street just started undercutting what they charge at pot dispensaries instead, right? So then they say, well, what we need to do is really make it free. So they want the government and our tax dollars to pay for these illicit drugs to be given out on a free to anybody that wants it. Well, so first of all, that's not going to happen, right? That's why I don't try not to take people seriously to talk about safe supply, because that's just ridiculous, right? If you really think about the amount of money that would cost the federal government and how are they going to raise that money to pay for that. And then you want your government to start playing drug dealer in that way, right? The
lost revenue, the lost income taxes of those people that are using and are unable to work, and then the hospitalizations, the cost of that would be
right. There's two things with that. One, the pharmaceuticals aren't going to make and give away the drug for free to the government, are they? No, they the government gives away the COVID vaccine for free, but Pfizer charged them billions of dollars to make that vaccine. Let's be real, right? So it's about money. And of course, big pharma is chomping at the bit, because they'd love to produce pharmacy grade heroin and give it out to people. Absolutely, they would. But you have to think deeper. Like, would you want your 18-year-old son or daughter to be able to walk into a heroin dispensary down the street and buy some heroin just to try it? Are you cool with that as a parent? You have to ask that kind of question. And so, and the problem is
something you mentioned earlier too, like, I think an economist can take a look at what's happening in the drug market and provide some insight into why addiction is happening as well. And so if you make it free and you increase the supply and you make that super available to people, you will see an uptick in, addiction and death.
Well, not only that, but has anybody, I know this is silly to say this, but has anybody gone down and asked the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico if they're cool with stopping?
Right.
Because they're not going to stop. You think they're going to stop? They just diversify into something else. There'll be another drug that comes along. I mean, it's the same cartels that are doing the human trafficking are doing the drug trafficking. It's the same people. Yeah. So, you really have to think, are they going to? Of course, they're not going to stop. It's people are making assumptions without involving all parties involved. And despite the fact that it's the cartel, they're a party that's involved. Nobody's asking them what's going to happen. So I just think that it's kind of a silly notion. I think it's kind of this weird utopian kind of socialistic idea that the government's going to just take care of you. And, that could lead to like what I call neo-feudalism, where you have millions of people dependent on a drug, and now they're all waiting on the government for their handout, their daily handout of drugs. Do we really want that scenario?
That's interesting, where socialism actually supplies the opiate of the people.
Yeah.
That's an interesting something kind of cycling back around.
So I have real trouble reconciling that notion, because the answer again is recovery.
Yeah.
It's there in front of all of us. It's there. And some people need that nudge. Like I needed that nudge to find
an
recovery.
Enforcement edge.
Right.
Yeah.
It can't just be all carrot. There has to be some stick in the process for a subset of people. Not everybody, but for a subset of people that are struggling, especially ones on the street that are struggling.
I'm curious what you think of motivational interviewing, if you're familiar with that, and kind of that's something that we teach, and we teach to pastors to try and help people who may have an addiction to alcohol or other things, to try and encourage them to go get treatment. Do you see that as being too laissez-faire as well? Is that something that's there's no stick involved, or what's your thoughts about that?
Well, I know a little bit about that. I haven't done a lot of research on motivational interviewing, but the way I see it is that anything that will help motivate an individual to make a better choice around their addiction or alcoholism is a positive. It's a net positive. So when I talk about we need the kitchen sink, I really mean we need the kitchen sink with the ongoing drug crisis, because it's grown to levels now in this country that we have never seen.
Yeah, you need every tool, right?
Right. We need every tool. So when 5% of the population of this country is struggling with drug addiction or alcoholism, and other countries it's like less than 1%, then we have to start really examining, okay, 1, the drug availability, and 2, the reasons why, and 3, how to get as many of those people out of that bondage of addiction and into recovery as possible. So I'm open to any kind of scenario, even if it's a harm reduction scenario in certain cases. I'm open to that, because countries in Europe that have gotten their drug crisis under control, one city that's a great example of that is Amsterdam, which everybody thinks drugs are legal in Amsterdam. Well, no, hashish or marijuana is legal in Amsterdam, but not other drugs. What they did is they did that carrot and stick approach, where they brought the health department together with the police, and they went out there and broke up open drug scenes and started mandating people to treatment, and made treatment widely available. Yes, they did safe injection sites too at the same time, but they also went and busted and held accountable all the drug dealers and drug smugglers too. So guess what? Now they don't have this huge, massive drug problem like they had in the 90s on their streets, like San Francisco and LA and Philadelphia has right now.
Yeah, I think it's a bit deceptive when people say decriminalization. That's not exactly what happened in the Netherlands. That's not exactly what happened in Portugal either. They're still enforcing drug laws. It's are we diverting people to punishment only, outlets, or are we providing treatment and recovery? There's still a stick, as you say. There's still a stick in these places. They're not just becoming laissez-faire and do whatever you want.
Some of the highest level harm reduction advocates in this country, doctors and people with PhDs that I've talked to, they get it confused in their head. They think that they legalized drugs in Portugal, and I'm like, there's a if you look in the definition in the dictionary between decriminalization and legalization, they're two completely different things. So drugs are not legal. In fact, the usage of street drugs on the streets of Lisbon is prohibited. It's prohibited by law. So possession of heroin is prohibited by law. It's just they decriminalized it, so they bring you in front of a commission, like an administrative court called the Commission for the Dissuasion of Addiction. And they try to talk to you and convince you to go into drug treatment. And if you keep reoffending, they mandate you into drug treatment. It's that simple. So it's like the sad thing is that they cherry pick data and stats from the Portugal model, and they use it here to push this thing of decriminalization. But what their ultimate goal is drug legalization and that safe supply that we talked about. And I'm here to tell you, in my advocacy work, I'll fight and I'll die on that hill. That we can't let that happen.
Yeah. Well, I think I just finished reading Fran-Sicko, and it sounds like what's happening in the Tenderloin district is just a complete laissez-faire attitude towards drugs. So there's no enforcement. If you steal less than $900 worth of merchandise from a store, they're not going to prosecute it. They're not going to prosecute you for defecating on the sidewalk. They're not going to prosecute you for using in the street. And then, those policies have an effect, and they're not good ones.
Look, one time when I was on the street, I was standing on Hyde and Golden Gate Avenues in the Tenderloin, and I was smoking crack from a crack pipe, and I'd taken a big hit off the pipe. I'll never forget. And I'm sorry if this is kind of graphic, folks, but I'm just being honest. I hit this crack pipe, and I turned around, and a police officer had ridden up on a bicycle behind me, and he was standing there like 3 feet away from me, looking at me as I'm hitting my pipe. And I turned around and I looked at him, and I panicked, and I took my pipe out of my mouth, and I blew the smoke out of my mouth right into his face. Right into his face. You know what he did? He just told me to drop the pipe and walk away. So, you think what you see on TV is like the cop rolls up on you and you're using, oh, you get up, you go to jail. They haven't been doing that in San Francisco in years. So, I mean, I blew crack smoke in a cop's face by accident, and nothing happened to me.
Yeah.
Nothing, except I had to put the pipe down and walk. That's it.
And you think what could have happened if that had been the arrest that led you to getting treatment, and instead it allowed you to continue a very risky lifestyle.
That's right. So it's all about finding balance. That's really what it is. The reason why we're so laissez-faire now is because the pendulum had swung too far the other direction in the 90s.
Yeah.
And people have PTSD from mandatory minimums and what they call the reference the drug war, and what it did, especially to the Black community in this country. But the pendulum's now swung too far the other way, where, there's people openly talking about drug legalization now. And that's not the answer either. And in the meantime, there's all these people, millions of people suffering with addiction. And now 100,000 people have died from overdose from all these illicit drugs. And we're not doing enough to try to slow it down. And we're not doing enough to open up more treatment options for people to find recovery.
Yeah. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to churches. And you've already mentioned that the drug war with mandatory minimums and just focusing on prosecution, we have some PTSD from that, and it didn't necessarily work. Laissez-faire, that's not working either. It's this place in the middle where we're flexible and we use everything that we have at our disposal to get people into recovery, and that the recovery itself uses a lot of different models. Are there things that churches do around the homelessness and addiction problem that make it worse?
Well, it depends on what church you're talking about. So, it's hard because I don't want to single out any specific organization, but
there's the practice that you think is not helpful.
Well, there's one church in San Francisco that has a large harm reduction program where they go out and they hand out what they call drug kits to people on the street. I don't know. I understand about using clean needles because it stops the spread of bloodborne diseases. I get that part. But now they're handing out foil and straws and crack pipes for free to people that use on the street. And I think that specific drug paraphernalia has crossed the line into enabling. And I think more importantly is that when they do outreach into the street, into the community, they pass out all these harm reduction items, all this drug paraphernalia. There's no discussion about drug treatment. There's no discussion about recovery. There's no discussion about where they can go to find treatment. And I think that's one of the hardest things for me. And one of the things I advocate for the hardest in San Francisco and now in California is where can you go to access treatment? We need high and low technology advertising, literally, of where you can access treatment, and then create a pathway.
What do you mean high and low?
So high technology means, access off of your smartphone, off of the internet, of where you can go. And low technology means billboards in highly afflicted neighborhoods. Need treatment? Go to this address, right? Literally like that. Instead, we're posting billboards saying no overdose, use with friends. And it shows people partying, which is sending the wrong message. That's sending the wrong message itself. It looks like they're promoting drug use. Right.
Yeah, you're saying that it's common, right? And that's actually a sales technique, is to tell people that it's common, everybody's doing it.
Right. And I know their goal is to try to reduce stigma, but they cross the line into drug promotion every time. that they do it because they go too far. They go too
Yeah.
far. It's like there's nothing, I'm sorry, but it's for someone that used to use on the street like myself, there's absolutely nothing dignified about being a drug addict and using on the street in plain view of everybody with children walking by. You know, there's nothing dignified about that. And I'm not saying that person should be punished, because it's not illegal to be a drug addict. It's not illegal to be homeless, but for goodness sakes, let's give some people some options on where they can go to get help.
Yeah.
Rather than just, let's just have you use safely. Here's some needles and some foil and straws and a pipe.
Yeah.
Let's talk to them about, well, this detox down the street has 5 beds open. You can walk in there today and get a detox bed.
Well,
We're not having that conversation.
And as image bearers of God, we're allowing the image of God to be degraded and debased when we allow that behavior to keep happening, rather than saying there's something here that needs to be saved and redeemed and polished back up and brought to new glory by getting you some treatment. Instead, I'm just going to supply you the means to continue to degrade yourself and the image of God that's within you.
Right. But in public policy, especially in San Francisco, faith-based organizations do not have a seat at the table unless they're willing to go along with what you just said. Unless they're willing to go along with what you just said, which is why organizations like the Salvation Army, as an example, don't have as big of a seat at the table in San Francisco as they should for the kind of work that they're trying to do.
Wow.
Because
I know a lot of people who swear by that program too.
Of course. Sure. Yeah. Me too.
So we're a little bit over our time. I do want to just get one final question from you, and then maybe we can wrap up. But, our church a lot of times does hygiene drives for the homeless, providing food for the homeless. How do you think that fits into is it the same kind of advice that you would give, is connect this to messages about how to get help? Is it enabling to provide these products? What's your thought?
So I don't think that that's enabling, right? So enabling is that you're giving somebody something so they can self-medicate so that they can feel better, right? So giving someone a hygiene kit is just a basic humanitarian thing. Giving somebody food is a basic humanitarian thing. Making those connections with people that are on the street is a basic humanitarian thing that's really, really important, because those connections over time can build trust. And that's one thing that all sides, I think, agree on, from harm reductionists to abstinence-based programs and all that those connections are extremely important to make and maintain. So I encourage more organizations, more religious organizations, to get out there and do that. There was this Korean church in San Francisco that would come around on Sunday mornings and give out donuts and coffee to the homeless. And the guy would sit there and preach like with a really, really thick Korean accent. Nobody could understand him, but he's preaching to us, trying to help us. And I think that's beautiful.
Yeah.
I think we need more of that. But was he handing out bullets for your gun so you could shoot up some fentanyl? No, he was giving out donuts and coffee. Those are two very, very, very different things.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you so much for this conversation. This was fascinating to me. I think folks that watch it are going to get a lot from this as well. Your story is very heartfelt, and then you also have a lot of the facts and figures on top of it. Is there anything that you'd like to leave people with before we close out?
Addiction, the drug crisis and the homeless crisis are intertwined. And they will be our undoing in this society unless we take really bold action right now. And that action will range all the way from creating housing for people all the way across to drug and mental health treatment. But you need to ask your local and state leaders to start looking at, statewide addiction treatment systems, statewide mental health treatment systems, because as time goes on, the problem is getting bigger and bigger. California has almost 200,000 homeless people already. Many of them are struggling with these issues. If we don't start addressing these issues now, it's gonna get to a point where it's gonna be really, really hard for us to turn the corner. So, get involved in your community. Start talking to your civic leaders right now and ask them what their thoughts are, and try to get them to start thinking and challenge them to think a little bit differently, other than it just being a housing problem out there today.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a great note to end on, and I'll dice and splice this a little bit, and once I've got it ready, I'll give you a link to it as well.
Great.
I'd love to get an address from you as well. I'll send you the book that we use that uses a confession and absolution format. for our recovery meetings. And I'll send you some stats too that about religion and spirituality and so on. That might be, you might already know them, but just in case you don't. But yeah, I really appreciate this conversation. This was
Sure.
amazing, and what a testament to God's love and commitment and faithfulness in your life as well.
Thank you.
Some very powerful stuff there, brother.
Thank you, man. I'm super grateful to be here and to be able to talk about this with you and anybody else that will listen. And, like I said, my advocacy is growing now. I'm, doing speaking engagements and interviews, podcasts now, because I just want people to listen and to think and not just listen to the one prevailing narrative out there right now that it's just a housing issue. It's a drug crisis. It's a spirituality crisis. There's a lot of different things that are tied into that. And I think we just all need to kind of take a deep breath and find a new pathway forward.
Please click the like and subscribe button to get more content, and consider a donation to Resilient Recovery.